Hello. Basically, we didn't get a time to finish this, and we are starting a new chapter tomorrow. So I didn't want to mix kind of stories here. So I wanted to finish chapter 13, so we can answer some questions at the beginning of class, and then we'll head into 14. Okay. So kind of where we left off, just to kind of show you, is so Andrew Jackson. We talked about all of his critics, kind of what they would say about him, and how he was, they called him King Andrew, right? The Bank War, Indian Removal Act. Anyway, we talked about some other things too. We talked about, did we get to this? No. Okay. So first term, a lot going on. Kind of really, the nullification crisis, really laying the strong arm. And then we come to the second election against Henry Clay. We talked about Henry Clay before. Henry Clay's run against him before, did not succeed. We're going to talk about him in general as always being the bridesmaid and never the bride. He's always trying hard. Anyway, what's interesting about this election, there is a third party. We have third parties now in our elections, right? But that didn't really happen that often back then. This third party kind of came from hating the Masons, the secret society that is actually still around. Plenty of current or past presidents have been in it, but it's kind of a sign of privilege. And that's why Jackson was one, and that's why this kind of party develops in response to that. But they don't really make that much of a mark. But it's just kind of a fun fact for a third party. They have nominating conventions, which becomes a big deal, and today that's still a big deal. Okay, so last thing, one of the big things we talked about was getting rid of the bank, and he was successful for doing that. And then when he won again, he kind of saw that as a sign of, look, the people want to get rid of the bank as well. So he does. He takes funds out of the Bank of the United States, and there's him and Biddle fighting right there, and puts them in pet banks. It's kind of similar to wildcat banks. Pet banks are essentially like state banks. That like Jackson and Wildcat are basically even a little bit smaller than state banks. But the negative here is that if you have states and each state is responsible for how much money they're printing, and basically currency becomes not super stable. And one of the biggest areas that people need currency is especially like all the move west and buying land. And so Jackson passes the Specie Circular, which basically says that if you want to buy land out west, you need hard money, and that is silver and gold. And we're going to talk about this more, but that's going to become a big issue moving forward, is silver and gold. And should you use that? Why would you use it? There's less of it, and there's only a limited amount. So it's not like people can print off money, right? And inflation can happen. It's supposed to be a little bit more steady. What people don't like about it, we'll get more into this later, is that a lot of the poor people don't like it because it's hard to get, right? It's a limited amount, and they would rather print more money for more money to go around. Anyway, so he really takes hold of the economy here, and unfortunately leaves his successor with another panic afterwards. So the next election, now you have a new party that's really rising up, and it's going to stay powerful for a while. That's the Whigs. And really the Whigs, so if you remember, the Whigs were in England, and they didn't like the king. Remember the Whigs and the Tories? The Whigs didn't like the king, and they would criticize the king, and so really that idea came over to the United States, and now you have Whigs that don't like King Andrew. So that's a famous cartoon right there. And really it's made up of a lot of different people, and it's not like they have some solid platform for their party. It's really, hey, we don't like Jackson. And there's not liking Jackson for a lot of reasons. If you look there, you've got people who like Clay. So that's why they're a Whig. People who want states' rights, especially in the South, because of the nullification crisis. Northern industrialists who originally don't tie themselves to Jackson because he's this frontier man, right? This common man. And then you've got the anti-Masons as well. So in this election, Martin Van Buren, I think people might refer to him sometimes as a forgettable president, unfortunately. But really, he was the vice president to Jackson and really rides his coattails into this election. And that's really how he wins. People call him the Little Magician because this is their ideas, not mine, but technically he didn't really have a lot of skill or ability or personality like Jackson, but he became president anyway. So he used his magic to get into the presidency, but right away he inherits a panic. And that is largely due to Jackson. You've got same old kind of stories here. Pet banks, right? We talked about the currency and printing lots of money. Specie circular puts people into a tizzy as well. Over speculation, there's that word that we always talk about. There's actually a bad harvest of grain, and so that kind of ruins the economy for a lot of farmers. So there's a lot of reasons, but unfortunately, the big dog, Martin Van Buren here, has to deal with it. And so it doesn't get a great reputation for that. Okay, this is the last we talked about map-wise, what it looks like. Oregon's still here. Remember that we talked about there's 10 years where they're deciding, who's going to have control here, but right now it's kind of neutral. Mexico became independent from Spain. I guess that's a change. And then Russia's up there, right? Okay. Well, down here, over here in what we know as Texas today, basically a lot of Americans are going to migrate into that area. Just kind of that Western idea. Specifically, it's going to start off with Stephen Austin, basically given an area of land to bring like 300 families there. But the Mexicans said that they had to Catholicize them. They had to be Catholic. They had to listen to their rules, which is going to be the main problem. And then eventually they would become Mexicans. However, a lot of these people came in with no intention of becoming Mexicans and then still had that American mindset and heart. One of the biggest things that the rules, the law that we talked about, is that these people, because they're in the South, brought in slaves. They're used to that farming mentality and brought their slaves in. However, Mexico had emancipated their slaves, outlawed slavery. So that was one of the biggest sticking points, and just the fact that they weren't listening. So Austin comes to try and talk about it, and he gets thrown in jail, and this really kind of starts off the war. Texas decides to declare independence after that. And that's why, if you've ever heard of the Lone Star, Texas is called the Lone Star today, the Lone Star Republic. That's because back then that's what they called themselves. And it kind of starts off basically with Santa Anna, which is the dictator of Mexico at that time, basically comes in here and wipes out all these people at the Alamo. If you can see it right here. And kills them all, essentially. This becomes a big fighting point. Remember the Alamo and fight for the Alamo. And basically the same thing kind of happens at Goliad right here. The difference there is the Americans or the Texans surrendered. They killed all 400 of them, like brutally killed them. And so what the Texans see at that point is, look, they are not fighting fairly, and it kind of, instead of defeated them, it really reinvigorated them. And 1836, Santa Anna was finally captured. I think that thing's in the way. Anyway, finally captured, and they've signed this treaty that basically says that now these Americans or these Texans that have this new boundary line, it's the Rio Grande, and down here it's the river, and so it's kind of a natural border. Remember that, though, because that is a big disagreement between the Mexicans and the Texans, which actually becomes a big part of the Civil War later. Okay? So Texas has their independence. They're the Lone Star Republic. They really want to be annexed by America. It means America would essentially take over that area as part of their territory. But Americans were very hesitant to do this because it would be a slave state, right? Naturally. And so it really takes them a long time to finally bring them into the Union. And we'll talk more about that later because, again, that's another cause of the Civil War. But that's why they drag their feet. Okay, and then you get the next election. William Henry Harrison. So we know him. He was a Whig from Tippecanoe and Tyler, too. Do you remember this is the kind of that Indian Confederacy, that last hurrah that tries to take out Americans, but Harrison takes them out and kind of ends the Native American problem there. And so the tagline for this campaign, for Harrison's campaign, is Tippecanoe, that's him, and Tyler too. And Tyler is their vice president, which doesn't have much of a story yet. Why that's memorable now is because you'll see Harrison has a short experience as president, and Tyler jumps in, even though people don't really know who he is. So who is William Henry Harrison? Well, Van Buren, who's running for a second term here, says, oh, he's just a farmer in a log cabin who drinks hard cider, essentially calling him like a country bumpkin, right, or a redneck or something like that. Well, they decide to run with this, Harrison's campaign, as, you know what, that is a good idea. Let's pretend he is a farmer. He wasn't. He had a mansion and slaves, and he was an aristocrat. Did not live in a log cabin, did not drink hard cider. But let's go with this. And so you see this advertisement here, kind of a campaign advertisement. It's like really going, now why? Because the same reason that Andrew Jackson really took off was the idea of the common man. And, oh, he's just like us. Which is interesting because they're running against Jackson's Democratic Party, who came up with that, like King Mob, right? But now they're taking that idea and essentially running against them. And why I think that's so important is because really since then, and still today, presidential campaigns essentially try and make these candidates look like common people as much as they can. I mean, we've talked about Trump and how he has a huge following of the common man, people that are very different than Trump, but he tries to connect with them. Same thing with anybody really that's run against him now, is how can we find him, support the common man. Same thing with Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, and it's just what people do today, and it makes sense, obviously. Well, he had like the longest campaign speech ever, inaugural address ever, and then supposedly because of that, it was cold, it was rainy, he got pneumonia, and he died after only 4 weeks in office. So he had the shortest term ever for a president, which, big bummer. And I don't know if I pointed this out again, just a reminder, this is another general taking over the presidency, right? That soldier mindset. Okay, so, but what big idea comes from him? The two-party system and how that's really important, and how they both use the idea of the common man. Okay, so kind of big picture here, now that we have these new political parties, who are they and what do they represent? I don't know why it started like that. Just need to change that. Okay, so the Whigs, they want to use federal government. I guess you could say they lean federalist in that idea, but they want to use the government. And they want the national bank. They want tariffs, and they want to use those things for improvements in the country, like roads and things like that. They are more prosperous than the common man of the Democrats. And so kind of an opposite Here with Democrats, they care more about the individual. In the states, they don't want this big government that we talked about that, the bank and all that stuff. They want to restrain the federal government and give states more rights. However, both of them are deep down connected to that roots of Jeffersonian, like the Jefferson Republicanism. They don't want an extreme government in either way. So that's why the Whigs aren't the Federalists. I don't want you to confuse that. All right, so that's where we are, and hopefully that helps a little bit. See ya!